Joint meeting with the Maricopa Unified School District. As you can all see that around the table here we have these mics, and this is the only way that folks that are in the audience and in the recording can hear. So if you want to speak, please make sure you're talking into a mic, okay? We're going to do two separate issues here. First, we're going to start with the City Council roll call and start the meeting in that fashion. Then we'll move it over to MUSD, and then they'll do a roll call as well for their meeting minutes. So we'll turn it over to the City Clerk. Here. Great. Turned over to President Knorr.
Great. Thank you, Mayor, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Our secretary's not with us, so I'm going to call the roll. Member Anderson? Present. Member Judd? Present. Member Cotray? Present. Member Miller is absent, and I am present. I'm Anna Marie Knorr, and I'm the president of the governing board of MUSD.
City Council and the Maricopa Unified School District, or MUSD Board, shall hear a presentation from the Maricopa Police Chief, Steve Stahl, and the MUSD Superintendent, Dr. Tracy Lopeman, updating the city on the school safety issues, and this is for discussion only. So take it away, Chief Stahl and Dr. Lopeman.
I'm privileged to be here tonight. Some information regarding largely for over 7 every day that we must carry. Revolves around relationships, our facilities, and violence prevention, and that's the basically the content of what we'll talk about tonight. Now, because I'm a former teacher, I've kind of organized this into the 5 W's and the how. And our reporters in the audience will appreciate that as well, because it's just a good organization. I mostly want to talk about this multidisciplinary safety team because it is such a critical piece of the collaboration between our school district and the police department. As you can see, the WHO is district and school, police, fire, parents, student representatives, and behavioral health professionals. What we're doing is what Chief Stahl will credit as the best of community policing, where we will identify and problem solve regarding issues that can turn into school violence. Violence that takes place inside the school or happens because of things going on outside the school, but comes to the school because it's an attractive target. So when does this multidisciplinary safety team convene? At regular intervals to talk about safety plans, to talk about the facility analysis, to talk about improvements, to talk about refinements, but it also convenes situationally as incidents necessitate. This multidisciplinary team, obviously when it's a collaboration between the police department and the school, that would be happening at the district level, but it would also be happening at the school level as well in a much more specific fashion regarding specific issues that occur. I'd like to spend most of my comments on the why and the how of the multidisciplinary safety team, because when it comes to school safety, none of us can afford to sit on the sidelines. The importance of our relationship, like the one that we're demonstrating tonight, is critical to our effectiveness when it comes to school safety. We must stay connected with law enforcement, parents, students, and staff. A multidisciplinary approach towards school safety and threat assessment has gained traction towards preventing violence in schools and communities. Largely, that collaboration would include training for all of us in all the schools. Training so that we could recognize and report concerns before an individual turns violent. Our schools greet nearly over 8,000 children and adults every day, and each one comes with his or her own gifts and challenges, and we look forward to training our administration, behavioral health professionals, Police and fire students and parents to remain in tune with how adults and children respond to the daily trials and challenges of growing up and everyday stressors of life. More specifically, we can train our staff and students to identify pre-attack behaviors. And research shows that targeted violence is the result of an understandable and discernible process of thinking and behavior. Typically, people don't just snap. In fact, 80% of school shooting cases, other students knew trouble was brewing. So when we find out that trouble might be brewing in one of our classrooms or for one of our staff members, we would engage the threat assessment process, and that is the how. And there's 3 functions to a threat assessment. That's identify, assess, and manage. When we effectively engage in the threat assessment, we can interrupt people on a pathway to committing violence. And we use threat assessment as a form of intervention because we notice someone is troubled or there's a conflict or people are worried about a classmate or a coworker. In detail, identifying usually will sound to you like, if you see something, say something. Or as Chief Stahl will remind us that apps on our phone and on our devices now allow us to, if we see something, post something or share something in that fashion. And then authorities deal carefully and responsibly with that information. Assessment is the next step, which is gathering and evaluating information from multiple sources. And it's in the assessment process that we answer the central question, does someone pose a threat simply because they made a threat? And there can be a difference in those circumstances. And that is something that we're dealing with pretty much every day in our school systems, because kids say things that they may or may not mean. And the consequences are so tremendous that we do spend time distinguishing between a transient and a substantive threat. Finally, we consider how we can manage a threat. And really we're talking about what might have been revealed during that threat assessment, like what is causing the issue? Is it bullying, stress, loss, rejection? Management of the threat could include counseling services and parent conferences or other school supports that move away from punitive measures and are more therapeutic in nature. While facility analysis is a critical piece to our work together, the Chief and I chose not to address that in very much detail in this presentation, but rest assured, his staff and my staff are working closely together to identify and prioritize enhancements and modifications to the physical structures that make our schools more safe for students and staff. Finally, the multidisciplinary team, made up of a diverse representation of internal and external stakeholders, can engage in these processes effectively and collaboratively. In fact, just today, we had a highly informative presentation from the police chaplain, Dr. Ellis. And that's just one more example of the interdependent nature of our relationship with the Maricopa Police Department. And while that concludes my comments, I look forward to many more examples of the productive collaboration with Chief Stahl and the rest of his department. Chief?
Thank you, Dr. Loveman. Typical teacher. Let's go into details. I'm going to try to simplify things a little bit. As you all know, we have a 5-member team, 5 police officers and a supervisor that are dedicated to community response, specifically to school safety and neighborhood safety around the schools. You saw that there are 9 community municipal or Maricopa Unified Schools. And then also we submitted a grant for the grant that we submitted for was also one of the charter schools. So we're responsible for 13 schools in the city, not just the 9 Maricopa Unified School Districts. Those 5 members and the supervisors have gone on site to all the schools and done a threat assessment. Dr. Lopeman and I have talked a little bit. Some of the things that the officers have come up with are very simple and may not cost anything other than an inconvenience, so to speak. Some of the things that we noticed were vendors just coming into the property and not checking in at the front desk, going back to the loading dock and doing their thing. While that might have been acceptable practice in the past, that is not acceptable practice any longer. People, the staff, the students, the parents deserve to know who's on campus all the time. So something as simple as improving the process for vendors is a no-cost thing to the schools, to the parents, to the school board, and to the city itself. It might be a slight inconvenience to the vendors, but it's nothing they don't confront in other school districts throughout metropolitan Phoenix. The mayor knows, and we're not breaking any new ground, I guess. We submitted a grant for $300,000 through the COPS office, Department of Justice. We have received preliminary notification that we have been accepted for about half of that amount, $147,000. The problem is they haven't told us exactly what it is that we were awarded, because we submitted for information or for grant funding for camera systems, for app systems, and happy that we received grant funding for part of what we submitted our request for. We don't have the details on where that funding is going as of yet. So we will work closely as superintendent and chief, but I think the important thing that we're trying to relay, the superintendent and I are trying to relay, is I can make your school safe. I can make them absolutely secure. It's called a prison. And that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in any sense of the word for community and for safe and healthy learning environments. So we don't want to go that route. We want to make sure that we are working collaboratively with parents and with students so they are aware of what challenges we have. They can give us ideas on how we can meet those challenges, and then we present their ideas to the funding boards, to city council, to the school board, and we can make a plan for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and beyond based on all of the recommendations on top of the school threat assessments that the professionals will be doing on a regular basis. With that, I wanted to try to simplify it as much as possible, but I also know that you may have some questions. Hope we can answer.
Council, questions on this first part? Anything you would like further elaborated, or yes, Councilor Wade?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Dr. Lopeman and Chief Stahl, for your presentation. Appreciate it. I was curious when the multidisciplinary team meets, and where does it meet, and can anyone participate or come and observe the meetings when they take place?
In our recent discussion, Councilmember Wade, our recent discussion is we need to send out information from her staff, from her office, to her staff, to her parents and her students, requesting who wants to participate in the school safety program or the committee, knowing that it's going to require some of their time. It's going to be a time commitment, so we would want them to know ahead of time. It's not just being on a committee and showing up for the meetings. It's a time commitment to make sure that we are providing all of the students, all of the parents, and all of the staff safety based on a lot of research and listening to what the recommendations are from the professionals. We have not put together those teams yet. That is part of why we're here tonight, I guess, is to say, be prepared to receive something from the superintendent to participate on those multidisciplinary teams. Our team is already put together, fire department's team is already put together, but staff and students and parents is another hurdle to cross.
Right, it's the integration of the two agencies that is our very next step. We have a district level safety committee, and then each school has a safety committee that convenes regularly as well. And when we talk about these threat assessments that are happening regularly, because we're dealing with kids in crisis on a unfortunately frequent basis, the steps that we talk about regarding identify, assess, and manage are taking place on a fairly frequent basis with the school level teams. So our very next step certainly is the integration of the two agencies.
One other question, if you don't mind. We had a community forum, and the community came out in numbers. And I'm curious, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, is getting to the point where we can give the community some understanding of the direction. You've done part of that tonight, direction, and when we'll be able to reach out to the community to do so, as opposed to what we're doing here tonight.
Councilmember Wade, I too would like to report back to the parents who showed up and the students who showed up. What I would like to do, however, is be able to introduce all of the multidisciplinary teams to the rest of the audience so that they know they have a vested interest and they have a vested group of people that are speaking on their behalf. Rather than just the figureheads up there talking all the time, I would like them to see firsthand the people who have dedicated themselves to being on the multidisciplinary team.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, what's the approach that you're taking from an engagement and involvement perspective? I was there when we held the school safety forum a few months back, and we heard from a number of different levels, parents, some of the students spoke up, staff, police and fire, some of our board members and council members. What are you doing to encourage engagement, particularly with those people who you would deem disconnected, time challenged, involvement challenged? How do we reach that audience and that demographic so it's truly a community approach?
One of the avenues that we're using in the Maricopa Unified School District is the Superintendent's Advisory Councils. Those are parents, certified staff, classified staff, and students. And I'm meeting with them about once a month. And it will be through those channels that I will be able to reach on a very personal level people who are connected to their schools and who have sort of a representative role and will be in touch with their PTOs, the student council, teacher groups, classified staff groups, which could be bus drivers or administrative support, clerical staff, custodial. So that is the avenue through which I hope to create that engagement and that interest and further the conversation.
Vice Mayor, if I might add, one of the things that we're already doing that seems to be working extremely well is the behavioral health units from each one of the schools and from the district is working extremely well with community programs as far as bullying classes and safe dating principles and things like that. So there's a lot of things going on right now, as well as training on mandatory reporting laws and things like that that are already in the works that normally happen anyway, but the increased communication is very refreshing to see.
Thank you.
Councilmember Gussie.
My question is more of the protocol. So any given situation, and I know they're not all the same, but a recent incident that happened, who gets a call first and who makes a determination to close the school or send patrol or so forth?
Councilwoman Gussie, protocol is, obviously, we receive the phone call first if it's a 911 call, unless the call goes to the school's behavioral health person, who then the instruction is for them, again, to call the police department as quickly as possible, depending upon the danger presented at that time. If you're talking about a dangerous incident where school is shut down or a lockdown procedure is in place, we are advisors to the school at the police department. So the school makes the final determination as to whether to lock down the facility or not. We just advise them on, we think it would be a good idea under this case, or we think, this one should be fine. But it is totally up to them. Notification, if notification is sent out to all the parents, they have a notification system and we have a notification system, so we're both blasting the social media airwaves to make sure notification happens.
President Noor, do you have any, does your board have any questions?
I was just going to ask them that question. Do you have some questions?
Well, I have a question, and then I also want to clarify. Our schools, when we have a threat assessment, we really do value the opinion of our police department, and if they tell us to lock down, we're going to lock down. If they tell us to close the schools, we're going to close the schools. Because the most important thing is to make sure that not only our students, but our staff are safe. And we're working on I know that I got the message at 5 a.m. On my email, on my cell phone, on my home phone. So as long as the parents make sure that their information is updated, because those things change so many times, they'll get those robocalls, because those do go out district-wide. My question is, Dr. Loatman, what is the timeline? When is the date that we want to have these teams established?
Certainly before we go on winter break, so that we're going to have information from our grant funding, and we'll have outreach through our advisory councils as well, and we'll be able to engage those teams before we go on winter break.
Great, thank you. Member Anderson has a question.
I did. Okay, so I feel rude with my back to you, so I'm going to turn around quick. I'm not being rude, I promise. My question is for Chief Stahl, and I'm following up with, I know you presented to our board, and hopefully people saw that board meeting on the COPS grant, safety protocols, recommendations for our schools, and I just want to follow up with the same question I asked then. And I know that SROs are going to not be at the middle schools, which I still am concerned about that. So I would like to, again, try to figure out what that cost would be if we chose as a school district to do that. I know that you've got and are implementing a community patrol where the patrol officers are actually, let's say, in Maricopa Meadows, and they're kind of around where the schools are. My question, again, is how do we go back to SROs? Because I do think the on-time face person on campus goes a long way. My next question is, how many other schools and districts are going to this community policing protocol? And then the other part of that is, with the COPS grant, before the cameras and the apps and everything are put into place, will that be in line with board policy and also with the protocol of each school? Because again, I'm concerned about cameras and our students' privacy. So if you could just clarify that for the public, and I know you clarified it for me at that meeting, but I just, when people hear cameras and they hear apps and they hear, all this other jargon, it's nice to know what their plan is. And I know you didn't want to get into some details on the COPS grant, but I think that that is a huge part of our school safety, and parents want to know. So that's a lot, but
I'll see if I capture it all. Thank you, Board Member
Thank you.
Anderson. As you all know, because of calls for service and workload, we did have to pull 2 school resource officers out of the middle schools. just looked at statistics again today. Your calls for service have not diminished at all in the middle schools, so there's still a great need for it at the middle schools. But more importantly, as you mentioned, the one-on-one interaction is between an officer and a student and a staff member and a parent is extremely important in building trust in communities and trust in the police department and making people feel comfortable approaching an officer rather than running away from an officer whenever an officer shows up. As I mentioned in the school board meeting, we really want to come on campus as much as we possibly can so that people get used to police officers being there, not in enforcement issues and not when we're required to be there, but because we want to interact and maybe have lunch with the students or whatever that may be, read to the students as we do in the elementary schools and the like. So to replace the school resource officers, it's $113,000 per officer, which includes the vehicle and all of the benefits and everything that a police officer gets, and health benefits and all that other stuff. I believe the last number was 113,000. So and there are a variety of different ways that school districts do that. Some of them split the cost between the city and the police department. And in the old days, school resource officer jobs used to be a 9-month-a-year job. It's no longer a 9-month-a-year job. It is a full-time job because when school's not in session, the school resource officers are training, they're doing school assessments, they are visiting the kids at home, some of the high-risk kids that are having problems. We want them visiting with their kids at their home and their parents at their home so that we can let them know that we care about them and we want them to have a good summer or a good, vacation or whatever it may be, and we want to stay in touch with them. So, however the city decides to do that, and however the school district decides to do that, we're open-minded to anything you may have in mind. I believe, and I think you all believe, I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, I believe the high school and the 2 middle schools should have school resource officers. It pained me to take them out. Your question on do other cities do what we're doing here in Maricopa? No. This is a pretty inventive way for us to try to do regular police work that involves the community that normal police officers would have to respond to anyway, but have that team do it in connection with the school and the neighborhood around that school. Many of the incidents that these officers will be handling will be school connected in some way, shape, or form, but maybe off-site, not on school grounds, at a school bus stop, walking from the bus stop to home, and there's problems that happen there. Bicycle safety, wearing a helmet, things like those that happen between school and when they finally get home. So this is new. This is something that I thought we could optimize our efficiency as best we possibly could, even though we had to pull the school resource officers out to still have them in the area. One of the team members is a traffic officer, so he will be conducting traffic safety on a regular basis. If you haven't seen him, feel fortunate because he likes to hand out financial reminders of how to drive safely in a school zone. So we hope to add one more of those officers real soon. We have submitted in the budget to get another motor officer. So they will be working the other days that this officer is not working. So we'll have 7-day coverage. I forgot your last part.
Cameras, cops grant.
Cameras, yes. I promised you, and I promised Dr. Lopman, this was one of her concerns as well, and all of your concern. This is your school property. This is the student school property. This is the parent school property. This is not our property. We are going to make recommendations based on our training and what the best practices are out there on where to put the cameras for best optimization. Again, we could put cameras all over, and then what would you have? You would have a prison. So that's not acceptable. We want to put them in the best places for optimization. I got to be honest, in the assessments that we've done thus far, outdoors at the gates where people are coming in, ingress and egress, and then the parking lots and things like that are probably the weakest areas that we want to address first. And then we'll worry about the inside as the inside comes around. But I don't, if we are good at doing what we do, locking gates for ingress and egress after a certain time so that the campus only has 1 or 2 points of ingress and egress, then we won't have that need for the camera necessarily inside as much. We will be able to see who comes in, which gate they came in, if they were a threat, and we'll be able to address the threat more efficiently knowing which gate they came through. So it's your property. We'll work together as that multidisciplinary team, make the recommendations to the big multidisciplinary team, and then proceed from there.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the governing board? I do have a quick question. Earlier you talked about collaboration, and I love the collaboration of our local school district and our council and our community and the police department. But I'm just wondering if there's a way to use the county possibly. I mean, we're part of the county too, or even the state, or just to maybe explore even having them participate in this process at any level to see what they could contribute, if anything.
I guess we do to a certain extent, and I'm curious as to where you might be going with your point and your question, but when we do active shooter training as an agency, we invite all the surrounding jurisdictions, because if something like that were to happen, everybody's coming, whether we like it or not, and hopefully we train them the same way we're trained so that we don't have an even more traumatic incident. So Pinal County always comes to the training, our neighbors at Ak-Chin, our neighbors at Gila River, and even our neighbors at the Central Arizona College come to the training, participate in the training, and we collaborate and we share radios with them, radio channels with them. So is that the direction you were going?
Yes, I just wanted to ask if they're involved and maybe even in this going forward, if there was a representative from any of those law enforcement agencies that wanted to participate in our school safety plan. I think that the more people who are involved who have resources and the ability to help, the better. So.
Yeah, and most of them have students that go to school here too, so they have a vested interest. Yes, thank you.
Right.
If I may add, I don't think there's a conversation that Chief Stahl and I have where SROs and the presence or absence of them does not surface. We both recognize that value, and I know we both remain committed to a creative problem solving around that, whether that includes state, county, city, whatever, anything in the known universe is worth exploring to create that meaningful police presence on campus. As a district, and the MUSD board understands this and certainly endorses this, we can be critical, the district, the schools can be critically helpful in making sure that kids grow up seeing the police as allies and not enemies. And that SRO presence, playing basketball, having lunch, asking kids if they're, what happened, if they're missing teeth, whatever, if the tooth fairy visited, I don't know. Those kinds of things, that kind of a relationship with a kid takes away the threat of the complicated relationship that sometimes kids and families have with police. And we can be helpful in that. And so we remain open to exploring any avenue that enriches our multidisciplinary safety team and also creates an opportunity to create for that police presence on campus.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said in reference to reaching out, to the kids. And of course, excuse me, not every family is the same, not every child is the same, not every community is the same. And so when there's an opportunity to diversify, if you will, what is taken into consideration when that happens in the schools? Are there programs? Are there particular instructors? How does one pierce the, I guess I say, social or cultural aspect of the students that are a part of your school system?
Say that again.
How do you get through? In other words, I mean, we're here. We're a city of 50,000, but we're not 50,000 here. So there are people who consider it important. Some people don't consider it important. Those that are here obviously do. So how do you though pierce that understanding with people who have come from different cultures, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, others that don't necessarily see the value in what we're trying to do, maybe see it as a hindrance as opposed to value? How do you make it through that?
Well, I approach every conversation with the belief that whoever I'm listening to or talking with has the same love and expectation of the kids in Maricopa. And if they think about their kids and their grandkids, it takes about 5 seconds for us to all be on the same page, regardless of our background. And if we always place what's best for kids at the heart of our conversation, even when we disagree, we won't disagree. That's my hope.
Councilwoman Gussie. Councilmember Wade, will you pass that mic down?
No, as Councilman Brown was just commenting, not necessarily, no. I don't suggest that there is a social wall. I'm just suggesting that there's an opportunity at times to be able to communicate with someone who doesn't necessarily see the value, as I said. They don't see the value in the police department. No, Chief, I'm not sure if you still have your community group representing different members of the community, but that certainly goes a long ways towards making that happen because you're talking to people who are in the community themselves. So that's a concern that I have at times, where there are people who want to have a more sense of respect, if you will, from the people who they're talking to, reference their children, reference law enforcement, even reference city council. How do we make sure that we get through to those people so that they feel comfortable to be able to come to us?
Councilmember Wade, I think that's the important part of, one of the important parts of picking the right multidisciplinary team, because that team is going to be the voice of that school to the police department, to the administration, one of the voices, and they're going to help us chip away at that dialogue. Because it's a generational dialogue too. It's not just a lingual dialogue. It's how does a 50-something chief of police talk to a 15-year-old high school student? It's different, and so it's a generational thing that we teach our officers to do all the time, but that team is going to help us chip away so that we can make sure they kind of set the framework of, hey, it's okay to talk to this police officer. You saw this, or you have this problem with safety. Talk to this police officer so they can take it to the big board to see if we can make that change to the whatever threat assessment we want. No voice should be too small on what is safe and what is not. Again, Dr. Lopeman and I can stand up here and make all the recommendations we want to, but if it's not accepted by the parents and by the students, we may have thrown that money away, and we want them to have that voice and help us make it safe in their eyes.
Councilmember Wade, will you pass
Thank
that
you
to
both.
Councilmember Gussie?
I just wanted to address your comment. I, too, am concerned about the SRO, and in a very polite manner, Chief mentioned that it was financial. I don't think there's any, I'm not going to speak for everyone else, but I don't think anyone here doesn't want to provide those SROs. If you could find the funding, we will provide them, but at this point, it's close to impossible. But it is a big concern, especially since most of the calls are coming from there. But I just wanted to address that. Thank you.
And I'll add one more comment to that topic. The COPS office, we accepted a grant 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago now, accepted a grant. It was a 4-year grant for school resource officers, of which there was matching. We expect that sometime later on this month or next month, I shouldn't say expect, that's a bad word. We hope the federal government sees it in their heart to not just contribute to financial enhancements of school properties, but reopen another school resource officer grant or something like that so that we can hopefully add to school resource officers again.
Councilmember Brown?
Chief, wasn't the SAFER grant application for additional manpower?
Safer grant was for fire. That did not cover police officers at all. This grant that we were awarded, $147,000, was for no manpower. You could not apply to ask for manpower whatsoever. It had to be technology or locking mechanisms, something to do with property and threat assessments on the property. That's all we could apply for.
You know, this is an interesting topic because when it comes down to the financial obligations, it's obviously something that affects us all, but I think oftentimes it's looked at as it's one jurisdiction or another. And the reality of it is that I did find it interesting that the federal government did, after one of the most recent incidents, put forth this COPS grant that was specifically for, you know, school resource officers on one side of it, and the other is technology and those types of things. And you know, President Knorr, you will also know from your profession that at the state legislature, you know, they had moved forward with some ideas and in the original budget had more money for that originally. Now, of course, things change and there's always, you know, the influxing winds of different political, you know, needs that come along. But I think that if we're really going to tackle this problem, to Councilwoman Gussie's point, it really needs to be a little bit of responsibility on everybody's side. You know, we all have a responsibility to protection and to educate and, you know, police forces in different jurisdictions, et cetera. But, you know, the reality of this is that it is impossible for any city or municipality to staff an SRO in every single school within their jurisdiction. And by that same token, that might also be the case that it might be impossible for a state who has limited resources, although much larger than the resources of a city or a county for that matter. Also, their limited resources as they're spread across many different avenues on what they have to fund. And the same goes for the federal government, but I think that, you know, many hands make light work. I think the same principle holds true that, you know, we as a constituency, certainly as a school board and as a city council, we can do our best to continue to talk with our elected representatives in truly understanding our roles and our parts. And while there might be, you know, formulaic in some respects, the reality is that the federal government needs to take a large step in providing funding, perhaps more than what has been provided through the COPS grants. I would probably argue much more. The same holds true with the state, and the same holds true with MUSD board and the city of Maricopa and our county. So I think that while none of us can afford it, you know, unilaterally, I think that we stand to really gain more if we can figure out a way in which we all contribute something versus just saying and pointing the fingers that it's you to do it all. And you know, I don't have the answers to how that's going to happen off the top of my head because it's a large stone to lift, but the reality is it's probably the best way to make it happen. And so hopefully here amongst us at this table as we speak, from a recorded standpoint, and as we move forward in our lobbying efforts at the state legislature and at the federal government side, that we'll be able to, press our elected representatives, us included, to find ways that we can work on these solitary issues on a more broad-based standpoint. And I think that's the answer, because again, I'm just not sure that we have the ability for any one of us to staff them all. It's just too much. President Knorr.
Thank you, Mayor, and I actually have state legislature written down in my notes, so we are thinking along the same lines in terms of that. And I do want to thank you for acknowledging that I do think it's a group effort, and I think this meeting here today is another step forward in us working together to find a way to fund safety in our schools to the level it needs to be funded. So thank you for those comments.
Appreciate it. Any other comments on this item at this time? Okay, we've spent about half the time that we have allotted here on this first topic, which is great, because we have one more. So we have item 3.2, the Mayor and City Council and the Maricopa Unified School District Board shall hear a presentation on the newly enacted SB 1529 as it relates to desegregation funds provided to MUSD, the potential impacts of SB 1529 to city residents, and other general issues that impact both the city and MUSD. This is for discussion only. I just want to outlay on this item, Dr. Lotman and myself and the city manager and others had a meeting, or were scheduled to have a meeting with Representative Leach and ATRA and other stakeholders on this particular topic. Unfortunately, as timing would have it, the meeting was scheduled for the day in which there was an incident here at MUSD, and so clearly we had to reschedule. We had hoped to have had that meeting so that we could provide additional updates and just the discussion that had taken place, but we'll have to forego that and report back at another time. But I know that Dr. Lotman is well versed on this, and so we'll turn it over to her for all of those comments and go from there.
Thank you, Mayor Price. Before we go on, I do want to thank the council and our board. I have tremendous respect and admiration for the responsibility that you have, the weight that you carry on your shoulders, not only for student safety, but for adult safety. We share a commitment to this community, and there have been numerous examples that lead me to know for certain that we can effectively find a path forward to improve our the supports that we have in our schools for safety. I'm looking forward to those conversations. So on with desegregation funding, in specifically speaking about access and equity for all students. I'll give you a historical summary that will take us back to the 80s and talk about the legal dilemma that our legislation has posed for our county and for our funding going forward. And then I want to share with you some of the ways that basically the ways that the money is used in Maricopa Unified and the kinds of results that we're getting. So when we talk about desegregation funding, I want to first tell you that the term desegregation is a misleading term. We're not ever going to talk about students being racially segregated or segregated by gender or religion or any other form of segregation. That is simply a term that was chosen at some point to describe the type of funding that we're getting because of some circumstances that have occurred. So that leads me to the historical summary. Title VI prohibits discrimination on the grounds of race, color, or national origin in any program or activity receiving federal funds, and schools obviously receive federal funds. The U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights enforces this law as it pertains to school districts. If the OCR finds a district out of compliance, the OCR and the district may enter into a negotiated agreement. In the past, going back to 1983, Arizona passed a law allowing school district under court order to raise local funds to meet desegregation costs that surpass the revenue control limit, and that originally only was applied in Tucson Unified School District. In 1985, that law was permanently established, and it included all districts under court orders or consent agreements with the OCR. In May of 1993, the Office of Civil Rights received a complaint against the Maricopa Unified School District regarding access and equity issues for limited English proficient students. So those could be students coming to school with a primary language of Spanish, Swahili, really any language other than English. So in December of that same year, we entered into an agreement with the Office of Civil Rights. And we had a 5-year plan per that OCR agreement that included 12 specific goals regarding assessments and benchmarks, and really watching the achievement of these students very carefully and providing specific programming and materials and evaluations and modifications based on data. It also included increase of specialized staffing and specialized training for the staff. It also had elements regarding parent communication and parent involvement. Between 2002 and 2010, Arizona limited the ability of school districts to increase desegregation budgets by capping the desegregation funding at various levels. Districts and the funding mechanism at that time, districts could budget and levy an additional property tax above M&O taxes for expenses incurred to remediate discrimination. And so 18 districts in Arizona currently budget for extra slots for such costs. And then in May 2018, the Arizona legislature enacted SB 1529, amending Arizona Revised Statute 15-910. And 1529 requires desegregation-related expenses to be paid from a secondary property tax rather than as a primary property tax. The secondary property tax must be separately shown on the property tax statement, and I think some of you probably got that. You see it as desegregation MUSD, which is not helpful. So, going forward, here's the dilemma. SB 1529 attempts to shift the tax burden from the state via state aid to property owners by labeling the desegregation levy as a secondary levy. However, SB 1529 did not and could not change the constitutional definition of taxes subject to the 1% limit. And we all may not be familiar with what the 1% limit is. Per ARS 15972, boards of supervisors are responsible for determining if the 1% limit will be exceeded by cumulative primary taxes from various taxing districts that apply to each parcel. If a board of supervisors must apply a credit against the primary property taxes that the property owners owe. This amount is then deducted from the school district's levy, and the state provides additional state aid for the school district to make up for the reduction. So previous to May of this year, the state was levying for those desegregation costs for all 18 school districts. Here in Pinal County, we have had that passed to the secondary tax according to that legislation. So this is the dilemma. The legislature did not change the ARS 15972 provision regarding how the Board of Supervisors is to determine the 1% limit credit and resulting state aid, even though desegregation taxes are clearly still subject to the 1% limit, a constitutional provision. So, I believe it was in August, the Board of Supervisors voted to include the desegregation levy in calculating the 1% limit, and it might be considered to violate that ARS 15-972. So what is the impact to property owners? That's pretty much what is at the heart of the matter for the good people of Maricopa. This is the estimate, $45 a year per $100,000 of assessed value, and that's just that DSEG MUSD alone. I know your tax bill is long, or your tax statement, I should say, because I have one too. But the overall estimated difference in taxes from the 17-18 school year to the 18-19 school year is estimated to be much less than that, at only 12 cents per $100,000 in assessed value. Obviously that's an estimate. So we can, I know that Mr. Rausch, our business director in Maricopa Unified School District, is here, and he can answer much more specific questions about how we arrived at that estimate if you are curious. So in Maricopa Unified School District, we receive each year $1.291 million to support English language acquisition in our school district. We have about 450 students who would be categorized as English language learners, and with those funds we are able to pay for 21.25 teachers, even though it takes 36 teachers to K-12 appropriately accommodate and educate those children. So this is a very meaningful amount of money that allows us to make a difference. Some of you may be curious about what access and equity means. We want to make sure that every student in the Maricopa Unified School District has access to a robust and appropriate curriculum, and a curriculum for someone who doesn't speak English is different than a curriculum for someone who does speak English. So we have to make sure that the curriculum is appropriate and the staff and the training and the methodology is appropriate as well. So that's what access and equity means. And one of the best ways we can ensure that access and equity are achieved to their fullest potential is when class sizes are managed so that kids receive, all students actually, all of our class sizes are kept lower so that every kid has access and equity to a highly qualified teacher. But we have obviously have isolated that fact here for the purposes of this conversation. Some of you may be curious about how we identify students as English language learners. When students enroll in school, they check a couple boxes on the primary home language assessment. It says which basically just asks, do you speak another language at home? And if they do, then they're assessed to determine an appropriate placement. And there's levels of English language proficiency from pre-emergent to proficient. And if you speak to educators, depending on where students come from, sometimes pre-emergent doesn't fully describe the cultural and linguistic differences that we are welcoming in our classrooms and making sure that those kids are appropriately educated and cared for. It's important for you to know that in the Maricopa Unified School District we have 2 A schools, 4 B schools, and 3 C schools. So that means that our programs are effective because 10% of those letter grades is proficiency on the AZ merit of our ELL students, and how those English language learners are advancing through their proficiency levels, going from pre-emergent to emergent, emergent to proficient, So there's a couple of levels and avenues through which their growth and achievement is monitored. And that's just at that high stakes assessment level. We test kids a lot. They're reassessed for their language acquisition on a yearly basis. And we provide quarterly benchmarks on all of our subject areas as well, because we want to know that what we're doing, that's data-driven instruction, data-driven leadership, and we want to make sure that every one of our students has access and equity to an appropriate curriculum and a great teacher. So, subject to your questions, that concludes my comments regarding the desegregation funding in MUSD.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopman. Council, questions on this item this time? Yes, Councilman Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Lopman, for that background. So I see this issue separated into two categories. The first, as you know, I was very upset with the way that the state legislation handled the rollout of this without any warning to MUSD, without any discussions with MUSD in order to be able to have time to prepare a plan for sharing this information with the city and the residents of this school district. And then I also see a second portion of this with regard to where do we go from here, because I don't see the court mandate as a forever funding, and I feel as though our school district probably should have goals that work themselves out of this desegregation funding. I'm sure you indicated that there are 19 school districts that receive the funding, but I'm sure within all the other school districts, they have the same ELL learning challenges, and so they're doing it without desegregation funding. So I'd like to understand the MUSD plan to move us out of having desegregation needs. Does that make sense?
Well, if you're talking about moving us out of needing the funding,
Yes.
that's a tricky question, and but the untricky answer is that $1.29 million is critical to us. Now, if you're asking if I'm going to find a way to not get money for the Maricopa Unified School District, the answer is no. I want to work, obviously we in Arizona understand our funding challenges to public education, and note that that is hopefully changing. But as a good and responsible steward of taxpayer money, we always have contingency plans. Just like you do as a responsible parent, homeowner, grandparent. What if, someone loses their job, or what if we need a new water heater? We have to have contingency plans. So we always have that in the back of our mind, knowing that this may have a shelf life. But I'm going to, pack it in ice and do everything I can to preserve this source and any other source of funding that we can, knowing that it comes with complications. And I own today's conditions, and I'm proud of those. I don't own 1983 or the other 18 or 17 or 18 school districts, but I own what we do with it today, and I can account for our progress and for our good use of those funds.
Yeah, I have no doubt that the funding is being used properly and for good reason. I just feel as though my interpretation of the court order was you have these 12 goals to reach to move yourself out of a situation that would be court ordered. And I feel as though it's a good thing for our school district to take a look at. And I'm hoping that in the coming years that the state is going to provide more funding to education. I think that's really necessary. And as that happens, I would like to see MUSD prepare a plan to move themselves, to request from the court system to be removed from that type of mandate. I just don't see it as a permanent forever. And I feel like to be proactive, we should be moving out of it. But you understand my concern.
I do.
And okay, thank you.
Fully.
Governing Board, any questions?
I just wanted to make the point for those in attendance and they may be watching at home that while DSEG funding may affect 19 schools Arizona-wide, those 19 schools are 30% of Arizona students. So this is not a small or isolated problem. It is going to have a significant impact on the education of students statewide. Additionally, in the state of Arizona, I'll make it akin to someone in just dire poverty that is currently receiving food stamps. Taking away DSEG for some of these school districts statewide is akin to taking away that person's food stamps. We're in a state right now in Arizona with our education funding that the removal of those funds puts us down to, you're starting to talk about school closure at that point. Luckily, Maricopa's passed an override, so we're not at that point. But for school districts that don't have that override to rely on, removing those DSEG funds put them into that position where you're starting to talk about school closure. So it's that important to certain school districts around the state of Arizona, and I think that should be understood. In terms of how do we make up for this if we do eventually get off of it, to me, the bigger question is, what is the state doing in order to be able to replace those fundings? This shouldn't be a question about what's the school district doing right now to be able to get off of that funding. To me, the question is, how is the state going to even get us to approaching average funding for schools? For individuals that don't know, in the state of Arizona, we aren't even remotely close to even average per pupil funding in the state of Arizona. So the public needs to know that. This is clearly a shell game, that we should be getting a certain level of funding that we aren't getting, and this is the way of state of pushing it onto our locality to be able to make up for their shortcoming for funding education. But on the larger picture, in terms of relating what our students, just to give you an example, I come from Connecticut. The per pupil expenditure in the state of Connecticut is almost triple what we get in this state. 3 to 1. That it's almost like a third world nation status when you're talking about a 3 to 1 difference. So that's how important this is. People need to understand that in the state of Arizona, we are almost at critical levels for funding public education. It shouldn't be about DSEG, and I understand that that's what we're discussing right now, but the problem is so much bigger than that. It's about sending a clear message to the state of Arizona that we shouldn't be here squabbling over DSEG funds. The problem is so much bigger than that. And I just want those in attendance and those watching at home to understand that. People need to support education, and the only way to do that is to make a difference in the state government. They're going to control that funding. We shouldn't be in this, my point is, we shouldn't be in this position to where we're discussing about removing funding at this point. So one of my questions that I have for Dr. Lopman is, what can we do? What can the state of Arizona do? What can MUSD do? Parents in the district to be able to put pressure on changing this or fight back in a legal way in order to block this attempt? Is this a done deal, or are we still in the midst of fighting this no-vote secondary tax increase?
Well,
Before you answer that, Dr. Lopman, I need to step in for just a second. The purpose for having this discussion is discussion. And I want to make sure Dr. Lopman has done a fantastic presentation, even more than what I was expecting for her to do this evening. So I want to be really clear in that this conversation should follow that mode of just conversation, if you will. There's no action that we can take. There's no, and also, of course, I'm very happy that the public is here so that they can get a broader view on who's responsible for what. And so I just wanted to share that before you answer your question there, Dr. Lopman.
I think my biggest point in asking that question is to be able to tell the public that there are ways that we can continue this fight and that they should be aware of that, and that it is being looked at, and to share with them how they can do that.
So just to insert one aspect that actually answers part of your question, I think. I just received a status from the Arizona State Treasury where they sold property in North Scottsdale for a total of $83 million. You probably all received the same thing. That goes directly into the school trust, which provides more money that they're able to provide out to the school system. There is prime land. This has been one of my things, you know, ever since I've been on city council regarding school district. There is, school and funding for school. There is prime land in Pinal County on Highway 60 that is completely owned by the state, should be sold by the state. It's like prime land to put real estate on, to have income coming from property tax for that real estate, income coming from sales tax from that real estate. That is one way we can get involved in terms of talking to our legislators and saying, let's move this property just like they did the Scottsdale property, which brought in $83 million, which is fantastic.
I'll just add a couple of details that are factual. And I think that some of us in the room are familiar with where we are as a state. Tucson Unified and Maricopa Unified School District are really the only two school districts and counties that have this funding moved to the secondary tax. The other 16 school districts, it has remained paid for by state aid because it doesn't exceed that 1%. So Tucson, the board in Tucson Unified has given approval to file a lawsuit because because Pima County decided to not levy the tax. So while the Pinal County Board of Supervisors has levied the tax, it's on the tax bill, it's going to come into the district, to the district as it always has, just from a different source. It's not coming to Tucson Unified. So when depending on what happens with those next steps, it could put this in suspension of some sort because of the litigation. Do I have that 85% close? Okay, good. So, for whatever that's worth.
I don't want to belabor the point, but Joshua is actually very correct. Historically, East Coast, Upper Midwest states always do much better as far as funding education for the youngsters than the Deep South, the Southwest. That's been a fact for eons. And it impacts greatly the level of education you get, and also deals with the homogeneous population, because those states quite often do not have the Latino population or the black population that the Southwest and Southern states have. That's part of the effect in terms of the funding.
I had asked our intergov, Dale, to stand by to address any additional information in reference to the current legislation. Do you think you have anything to add to what Dr. Lopman shared with us, Dale?
Thank you, Councilman, Board, and Council. Dale Webush, I'm the Intergovernmental Affairs Director for the City of Maricopa. I'll be here all night. Anyways, Dale. And so I do the lobbying on behalf of the city. As Dr. Lopman put it out, 1529 was enacted last spring. It was one of the budget-related bills. Came in at, post-midnight kind of thing. So with the election around the corner here, and many of us have already received our ballots, I think that a prominent message throughout this election has been education funding. And so I do believe that next session we'll see some attempts at trying to find a way to increase it. As was referenced earlier, the budget package that was put together this year, which includes this desegregation funding, there were pieces taken from here and there and here and there and here and there to cobble things together. And I've been around this business for about 15, 16 years, and that happens at the state level budget. So I think the hope is that there will be some more sustainable source of funding. I was down there the first day that 50,000 or so red t-shirts showed up at the Capitol, and that was a powerful message that was received. And so sustainable funding, I think, is one of the things that is a constant thought. Councilwoman Smith also referenced the state trust land sale up on Hayden and the 101. And I believe it was yesterday, maybe the day before, the Financial Advisory Committee for the state put out a report along with the Joint Legislative Budget Council that our revenues are much larger than we thought they were going to be at this point in time. And so the decisions as to what to do with that money, once you have a bigger pie, there seems to be more people with forks. And so we'll see if we can sustain this effort related to education funding through this next year.
Councilman Gussie.
Just for the record, I am a product of ESL, so I know it works. I didn't learn how to speak English till I was about 7 years old, so trust me, what you all are doing in public schools, I went to public schools also. It's working. I do have a resolution here that was produced by Councilmember Romero. Just a coincidence, that's my maiden name, but anyways, Councilwoman Romero from the city of Tucson. They adopted a resolution in opposing this. And this is I brought it here today because I wanted to know from the rest of the council, is this too little too late? And as you mentioned, the only ones affected was Tucson and us. Is it too little too late, or is it something that we could actually oppose and move forward to see if we could sway anyone in the future?
So I'm very familiar with that resolution, and we've had discussions with the school board, the superintendent, legal counsel, as well as Intergov and myself and others. And frankly, this is a discussion that council will have to have amongst themselves. Probably in an e-session is the best place to address it. Just so you know, there is some legal stratagems there. Just because we are in a public setting, and forgive me, you don't want to broadcast your legal stratagems for the whole world to see prior to going into court. And so clearly we have discussed this, and there are some theories behind that. So the answer to your question is no, it's not too late. But it's something that Dr. Lopman said earlier, which I don't think I'll continue to harp on, but rather just echo in the fact that Pima County is leading the direction on this. And there is some legal precedent set in the way that the last case that went before the court system was dealt with, and it was done in a similar manner. And so there is the thought process that maybe we should follow suit of that precedent. But again, that's for council to decide. It's for the MUSD school board to decide independently of one another, and then come back together and counsel together on the best way to go about that. So again, without dodging the question, but answering the question, I just want to make sure that it is an e-session item that we should probably further discuss.
My concern was it's too late.
It's not too late. Are there any other questions at this time? Yes.
Okay, so For me and for the Arizona School Board Association, we did make this an issue on our legislative agenda. That, first of all, this is unconstitutional. So whether you're talking DSEG funds or whether you're talking equity funds or whatever you want to label them, the issue is the way the legislature handled this by making it a secondary property tax instead of a primary property tax without a voter vote. That's the issue for me and for the Arizona School Board Association, that we need to protect what our taxpayers are doing, and we all are supposed to get a vote